Since cybersecurity is a team sport, a national strategy should eliminate the impediments that cause the private sector not to want to participate. We have a confused regulatory and enforcement scheme at the federal level, with some agencies, including my old agency, taking a help the victim view, and others, including the Federal Trade Commission amongst others, taking a blame the victim view. This federal schizophrenia leaves companies unwilling to engage with the federal government for fear of enforcement actions, public embarrassment, and worse.
Anyway, onward to Gus. As many of you know, he is a legal officer at Circle, a global crypto finance company where he's responsible for all legal, compliance, regulatory, and government affairs. And he started doing this in September 2018. His work in crypto finance and regulation complements his experience in homeland and cybersecurity. From 2005 to 2007, he was Deputy General Counsel, then Acting General Counsel of the Department of Homeland Security, focusing on all major security issues confronting the nation. There are a few. As the department's top lawyer, he helped lead implementation of Bush's comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative, designed to shore up the government's civilian networks from attack and to promote information sharing and cooperation between the public and private sectors.
Thank you so much. I am deeply appreciative to World Boston and the Lowell Institute and the Boston Public Library for inviting me here this evening, and Mary, to you for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it. I'm also deeply appreciative to all of you for deciding to spend at least part of your night here. For people interested in the national political scene, and I know from your being here, you all are, I understand that today was a very eventful day, and I appreciate you being here when you could be home watching C-SPAN reruns of today's happenings in Washington, D.C. A bit about tonight's proceedings. As a lawyer tasked with talking about one of the topics I find most interesting, it's very, very good to be held to a time limit, and I have one. I'll share a few views on tonight's topic, which is cybersecurity and geopolitics, for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions, which I will try my very best to answer. One additional note, I'm here in my private capacity, and the views I'm expressing tonight are not necessarily shared by my employers, present or past. So, what do I hope for us to accomplish this evening? A few things, 3 to be exact. First, I'll share my view of the cyber threat landscape, including especially what kind of cyber operations we're currently seeing across government and the private sector. And not only that, but a few theories on the motivation behind other nation-states' cyber attacks on the United States. Next, I'll talk about some of the advantages the United States enjoys in the cyber domain, but more importantly, the systemic impediments to an effective federal government response to these types of incursions. Finally, I'll discuss a few potential solutions that could shift the balance of power in our favor, or at least even the playing field. But first, an origin story of sorts about my introduction to cybersecurity. When I was serving in the Bush administration at the Department of Homeland Security, we dealt with many threats to the nation, potential terrorist attacks, including the thwarted airplane liquids attack in 2006, natural disasters, including hurricanes in Florida and Texas, potential pandemics, including the H1N1 flu scare, and a constant drumbeat of threat intelligence about people around the world who would do Americans and our allies harm. What we did not confront directly, however, was a cyber attack. Even so, at the national labs of the United States, work was being done. Our scientists were thinking about ways that cyber attacks could harm us. And one particular study caught everyone's eye at DHS, a video of an electrical generator caused to be out of phase by a cyber attack, essentially imploding on itself. You can actually look the video up on YouTube today. It demonstrated physical or kinetic effects of a cyber attack that could take down critical infrastructure of the United States, leaving Americans at risk of harm. The Bush administration reacted with the President's Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, or CNCI, which assigned the task of shoring up the federal government's cybersecurity posture to the Department of Homeland Security, and also assigned Homeland Security with increasing the flow of information sharing about cyber attacks between the government and the private sector. In planning to face the press about the CNCI, Secretary Chertoff and I talked about how he'd answer the question, why are you doing so much now? He said the real question should be, why didn't we or previous administrations do all of this before? I was proud to be part of that effort. That was in the late 2000s. Fast forward 10 years. After leaving government, I helped clients who were on the receiving end of nation-state cyber attacks to weather the storm, not just of recovering from a successful attack, but from the secondary effects of such an attack, including lawsuits, regulatory investigations, sometimes congressional hearings, and the like. More on that dynamic later. Three cases spring to mind that I can talk about. One, nation-state attacked an academic institution here in Massachusetts that helps the U.S. Navy with research by spear-phishing login credentials from people who work there. In another, a nation-state could not defeat the cybersecurity technology designed by a company, and that prevented it from getting information from a particular organization that it was interested in. So it hacked the cyber company itself. And by doing so, it stole the code signing certification and was able to bypass the cybersecurity that its target had on its systems. Finally, an unidentified attacker hacked passwords to post market-moving messages under other people's accounts on a popular social media platform. These are just a few of the types of attacks that we've seen over the past 10 years. And so many of the things that DHS predicted have come to pass. There have been cyber attacks that have had real-world consequences, such as Iran's destruction of Saudi Aramco's computers, or Russia's takedown of Estonia's internet or Ukraine's electrical grid as a precursor to an attack in that country. But there are many things that we did not predict. For one, North Korea's devastating attack on Sony Pictures over a disagreement about the contents of a movie. But most egregiously, Russia's concerted effort to interfere in Western democracy and undermine confidence in Western institutions, most notably by interfering with elections, but also by using America's advantages and freedoms against us. Our technological innovation, which brought us websites such as Facebook and Twitter, combined with our freedom of speech and press, was manipulated by our adversary to affect voters' views before the most important event in U.S. civic life, which is a national election. The unfortunate thing is that 10 years on, while the threat has metastasized and the stakes have only gotten higher, the measures that the U.S. government has put in place are largely the same as in the CNCI that the Bush administration put in place in 2008. We must do better, and tonight I thought we'd talk about how. So, regarding the cyber threat landscape, how are our geopolitical adversaries using cyber attacks for national gain, and why? First, we can talk about some of the dynamics that brought us to where we are today. The first trend is that it's not just personal information that they're after. A few years ago, a federal grand jury in Pittsburgh returned an indictment of 5 Chinese Army officers for hacking, economic espionage, and trade secret theft. What was in the allegations? Trade secrets, chemical formulas, email communications between the CEO and CFO of a company about how to handle merger and acquisition talks with the Chinese company, and the legal strategy in cases against Chinese companies. Frequently, these types of international issues are handled discreetly. Why then did the Department of Justice seek and then publicize this indictment? After all, there was close to a 0 chance that the Army officers would be extradited to the United States. My theory is that the United States wanted to send a pointed message not just to China, but to United States institutions and companies. When you're thinking about what to protect, don't be blinkered by the private information laws on the books. Every company is focused on personally identifiable information. 47 states, as well as Washington, D.C., and several U.S. territories have breached notification laws related to private, personal information. The EU has forced companies to invest even more in PII protection with the advent of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Unfortunately, this is what we've been trained to understand that cyber attacks are after: social security numbers, names, payment card information, health information. Think about the Target hack, or the Neiman Marcus hack, or the Home Depot hack. Because of these legal regimes, companies have focused on, and probably overinvested in, the defense of personal data at the expense of other critical data. Now, don't get me wrong, defending personal information is very, very important. But an attack that makes off with, or alters, or destroys a company's intellectual property, or computer code, or key communications, or control over physical assets can have more of an effect on the company's enterprise value as well as the nation's security than a personally identifiable information breach ever could. The second trend is that the sophistication of our adversaries is on the rise. Because most everything that we value today is in digital form, from personal information to credit card numbers to IP and communications between government officials and senior executives, bad guys are finding more advanced ways to look at, manipulate, and monetize that information. There was a gallows humor saying in the government, there are two types of companies: those who know that they've been hacked, and those who have been hacked and don't know it yet. But it's true. If any organization, governmental or civilian, has anything valuable on its networks, it is already a target. As we move more and more of what we consider to be valuable into the digital domain, including trade secrets and other intellectual property, financial information, strategic communications, customer data, and control over physical assets, our networks are greater targets for nation-states, thieves, spies, competitors, and others with malicious intent. Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, was asked why he robs banks. His reply was, because that's where the money is. Where the money is now is on all of our networks, government and civilian. Final trend that I'll point out to you is the attackers are moving from targets of convenience to targets of choice. What does that mean? The bad guys will no longer ring the next doorbell if your alarm system is on. There are people who are employed to find a way into our systems. It's their job. They will do so. The popular image of a hacker as a lone wolf basement dweller, often wearing a hoodie, is misleading today. I mean, lone hackers certainly exist. For example, the hacker known as Guccifer, who hacked prominent political figures' accounts until his arrest in 2014, operated in just that fashion. But it may be more accurate and useful to think about today's hacker wearing a business suit or a military uniform instead of a hoodie, and headed to an office from 9 to 5, where his or her job is getting into a particular network. Now, don't get me wrong, if you see a guy wearing a hoodie at a terminal where he's not supposed to be, you should call the authorities. He's probably up to no good. But the mindset needs to change. We need to understand that there are professionals who are trying to get particular information from particular networks. So given these trends, what are the types of attacks that we're seeing from our geopolitical adversaries? Really, there are three. And I've alluded to them so far in this talk: intellectual property theft, critical infrastructure attack as leverage or prelude to war, and influence operations, undermining Western values and institutions. I'll mention a few additional points about each of these three things. First, IP theft. A few years ago, the United States intelligence community estimated that the US economy loses $400 billion in value annually, that's billion with a B, every year through IP theft. This is big business. And certain nation states around the world have based their plan for economic progress over the next 5 years on the acquisition through whatever means necessary of R&D that's been developed in other countries. Second, critical infrastructure. This is a term that we throw around, but it makes sense to define it very quickly. It's those systems within the United States without which the loss of life or impact on civil society would be material. We have learned over the past few years that nation states have put cyber implants in various of our systems and the systems of our allies, including industrial control systems like the example I used before, the power grid, and the financial system. Key systems that if they were taken down either to make a point or as a prelude to a kinetic military action would be devastating to the United States. And finally, I think the one that we have focused on most closely over the past 2+ years, which are influence operations. The origin of this is very interesting. In 2011, when Secretary Clinton was Secretary of State, she gave a speech of comfort to our allies in repressive countries around the world. She said that America would use its technological innovation to make sure that they had access to the wider internet and that the availability of them to get news about democracy would not be cut off. Certain other players in the world, most notably Vladimir Putin, took this as a direct threat. And the Russians went back to the drawing board and decided how they would use this technology, which Secretary Clinton was touting, for their own ends. And they weaponized it. As we've seen over the past few election cycles, not just in the United States, but in Europe and elsewhere in the world, Russian influence operations have been directed at the Brexit vote, votes in France, other votes in the UK, votes in the US, and influence operations, aside from elections, have been directed at undermining trust in Western institutions, not just within the United States, but in the wider world, such as NATO. There is a debate about whether the election was hacked, is the right way to phrase what happened there. Whether or not any particular voting machine was hacked by a nation state, it doesn't matter. The goal of that particular adversary is to undermine trust. And by even raising the question, trust has been undermined. We've also seen in the recent indictments from the Special Counsel's Office related to a benign-sounding organization called the Internet Research Agency, that Russia was employing 200 or so folks to make social media posts on various US websites, including Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So, what are the advantages that we have in this ongoing battle, and maybe more importantly, what are the United States' impediments to success in this area? I mean, the advantages is that we develop the technology that powers the world. This is not just a technological problem, but the United States and folks in Silicon Valley and New York and yes, definitely in Massachusetts are coming up with the technologies that will power Web 2.0 and Web 3.0. The dark side of that development is that our enemies have figured out ways to use the technology that we're developing to make life better against us. So I want to point out 3 things that I think we have to overcome. The first one is the peculiarity in the United States of the ownership of what we consider to be critical infrastructure. The second is the weaponization of modern technology. And the third is what I call the decentralization and the re-centralization of trust. On the first one, we talked about critical infrastructure already, but 85% of what we consider to be critical infrastructure, that is those things without which civil society might break down and Americans would suffer harm or die, 85% of that is controlled by the private sector. It is owned by the private sector. Therefore, in a lot of cases, it's voluntary for those owners of critical infrastructure to up their cybersecurity game. And as I'll mention in a few moments, there are impediments for those private sector owners to participate in information sharing and other programs with the government because they view the downside of doing so, which might be litigation or government investigations or reputational harm. The second of these trends is weaponization of the technology that we in the United States have developed. And just think about a few of these things. The Internet of Things is a catchphrase, but what it is the connectedness to the Internet of everything, not just computers, but thermostats and lights and televisions and what have you. I've read about refrigerators and microwaves that are connected to the Internet. Each of those connected devices, if the security of them is not so good, can be deployed in what's called a botnet. And we've seen devastating attacks on systems, critical infrastructure systems within the United States and elsewhere by these botnets. And cloud computing. Cloud computing is another development over the past several years in the United States, which has made work and storage of data easier. But if important information is all kept in one place, it becomes a very, very attractive target for adversaries. I'll talk about another indictment. This one, a combined effort between the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the federal prosecutors in New York for some hackers who were sitting for 3 years within the newswires services of the United States. Now, you may not know the newswire services are those companies that public companies use to broadcast information about those public companies. Like, our earnings are up this quarter, or our earnings are down this quarter. They used this information. They didn't hack the 100 or 20 public companies that they wanted to trade on. Instead, they found the aggregator of all that information and watched the information go by. And when a company was going to report tomorrow that revenues were going to go up, they traded on that information. When they reported that revenues were going to go down, they traded on that information too. So the lesson to take from this is that it's not just the information on our own systems that we have to worry about, it's what we share with others. Finally, I'd like to talk for a moment about the decentralization and re-centralization of trust. What did the Internet do? I mean, if you think about the way that at least there are many younger faces in the audience, but at least I used to consume news, for example, when I was growing up. There were 3 networks. It was CBS and ABC and NBC. And the news that we would receive was largely the same from each of those sources. We would read the newspapers. With the advent of the Internet, all of that changed. Anyone could be a publisher or a broadcaster or a producer, and they became that. Trust in the editorial function of news organizations went down. That was the decentralizing force. Anyone could publish whatever he or she wanted to the Internet. But a funny thing happened during the development of this technology, which is that it re-centralized. It didn't re-centralize into newspapers or TV stations. It re-centralized into technologies such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google, who have business models to promote engagement with the site, with content on the site, to make sure that the advertisers that are advertising on the site were spending their dollars wisely. Their business model was not to edit or screen or check for veracity the things that were being posted. And unfortunately, as we've seen not just in our own elections but around the world, Russia knew better than the United States how this technology could be used for ill ends. So let me close by talking for a moment about a few ideas that could make this better. I mean, first, it's clear from everything that we've discussed so far that cybersecurity is the one battle space where we're each on the front lines. It's not just a federal issue, but a national issue. So the first line of defense, and sometimes the greatest vulnerability, is people. Not because folks are malicious, even though there are those, but everyone who is trusted by their employer has at least 2 or 3 or 4 endpoints where you can access the company's information. Every employee is a data manager, and therefore every employee needs to be part of the security team. If we don't know how to participate on the cybersecurity team as individuals, then entire systems can fall as a result of those failings or lack of training. So good cyber hygiene is important. We have to be more resistant to phishing and spear phishing and social engineering, which are techniques that our adversaries use to try to get our passwords to pose as us on trusted networks. We should not reuse passwords, usernames and passwords across sites. When we do, that one hack that disclosed some usernames and passwords, which you don't really care about because it was some site that doesn't contain sensitive information, actually matters if the usernames and passwords from that site can be used on a government access site or on a financial site or on a bank site. More importantly, what can we expect from our government? As I said, in the last 10 years since I've left, the ball hasn't moved in the distance that I would have liked it to. There are a few things that I think we could focus on. First, there's a blame the victim versus a help the victim mentality in the federal government. Since cybersecurity is a team sport, a national strategy should eliminate the impediments that cause the private sector not to want to participate. We have a confused regulatory and enforcement scheme at the federal level, with some agencies, including my old agency, taking a help the victim view, and others, including the Federal Trade Commission amongst others, taking a blame the victim view. This federal schizophrenia leaves companies unwilling to engage with the federal government for fear of enforcement actions, public embarrassment, and worse. While there can and should be regulatory scrutiny for the cyber equivalent of a bank leaving the safety deposit boxes unlocked, we have agencies of the government blaming companies for sophisticated attacks that, as the Office of Personnel Management breach revealed, the government itself cannot repel. And that's more akin to investigating a shooting victim for not wearing a good enough bulletproof vest. In the cyber world, if it's country versus company, as it so often is, the company is eventually going to lose. Looking at the federal government, only the president can require a unified all-of-government cyber strategy to eliminate this phenomenon. This includes promoting information sharing, helping the victim to get back stolen assets, and importantly, taking a measured approach in enforcement and mandating disclosure. Second, quickly, we want to make sure that cybercrime does not pay. Nation strategy should make cybercrime more expensive or costly for the perpetrators as well as the countries that sponsor them. We should have a national policy of raising the risk of engaging in this behavior, not only ensuring that it does not pay, but that it could be very expensive to engage in it. The Obama administration took a step in the right direction in an executive order which allows the Office of Foreign Asset Control within the Department of Treasury to put bad guys on the economic sanctions lists, eliminating their access to the international banking system. So we have, as a government, should not only detect when American intellectual property is in the hands of foreign adversaries, which we already do, but we should assist U.S. companies from whom that property was stolen by sanctioning, by preventing the importation of products using the stolen IP, and where applicable, prosecuting the bad guys under the economic espionage and theft of trade secret statutes. Finally, we should provide greater, more robust federal defenses for critical infrastructure. When you discuss this with general counsel and security personnel from companies that own or operate critical infrastructure, they would like the federal government to take a more active role in defense. This is an acknowledgement of the above principle that if a nation state targets a company, the company will likely lose. The balance shifts, however, if another nation state, that is the United States, takes part in the company's defense. Such a policy would have to be developed carefully, but the federal government should not be only a forensic or investigative or cleanup entity after an attack. It can be and should be a participant in network defense, especially for those networks we consider to be critical. And that brings me to the end of my talk. I hope that this rundown of the threats and the factors that brought us here and some potential solutions have given you some things to think about, to discuss with your friends and colleagues, and perhaps to take to your elected representatives. Cybersecurity is the one battle space where we're all on the front lines, so let's figure out how to prevail.
What role can the U.S. play, for example, in helping states that are democratizing to not be victims of some of these actions, states like Ukraine or other developing democracies?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good one. I mean, there are two points that spring to mind. I mean, the Russian operations in Ukraine were both, information or disinformation campaigns, as well as active interruptions of internet service in that country, as well as critical infrastructure. I think the United States is in a very good position to provide technical support to our allies on protecting critical infrastructure. One thing I didn't mention during the talk is that we focused on geopolitical adversaries, but frankly, we are the best in the business at both cyber operations on the internet and cyber defense. There are programs where we share this information with allies, and of course that's a matter for the State Department and the intelligence agencies to figure out just how they do so. But I think America the United States is in a good position to help our allies in the way that you described.
And then we have one over here, and then we'll have to Irv.
Hi, thanks for coming. So it was reported yesterday that the U.S. Cyber Corps had shut down the Internet Research Agency during the midterm elections. It's kind of unclear how powerful that was. If it was more of signal sending or kind of a sign of more things to come. I just wanted your reaction to that and what you think about that operation.
I read the article in the Washington Post. I was encouraged to read it. The fact that the intelligence community was directing its considerable talents at preventing the disruption of the midterm election gives me hope. The article contains some interesting facts. Ellen Nakashima in the Washington Post wrote a very good rundown of what happened, and the detail that jumped out at me is that the folks in the Internet Research Agency, that is the Russian trolls who are tasked with providing disinformation on our social platforms, were calling their own IT shop, saying, "I can't get through." That's the sign of a good operation. It's not something that the United States broadcast. I think this information was disclosed through very good reporting by folks at the Washington Post and elsewhere. So I don't know if it's if it is a signal of things to come, but I view it as positive given what we know about the Internet Research Agency's activities in the 2016 election.
My question has to do with back in December of 2011, the Iranians successfully took down a Lockheed Martin UAV that was in Afghanistan. They cyber hacked it, they brought it down, and they've been reverse engineering it since, which is how they get their UAVs. Given our reliance on UAVs and things like the F-35, which I understand is going to have an unmanned version as well, what are we doing to protect our military against these kind of attacks?
Almost everything that moves in the United States is controlled by a motor for precision, is at risk for implantation of viruses of various kinds, including sleeper devices. and including our military systems and the chips that run them. So I would ask, can we possibly get legislation passed for mandatory screening of those chips, and do we have the tools to do that screening?
Thank you for both of those questions. I think they're related. The complications that I described earlier in defending civilian networks do not apply when it comes to military networks. As I said, we do have the best in the business at NSA, and they learn from their mistakes. I don't think we're sending up drones that are going to be susceptible to the types of hacks that we've experienced already. But unfortunately, we learn our lessons sometimes through failure, instead of in the way that I described earlier with the folks at the national labs actually looking around the corner and seeing the potential for something bad to happen before it happened. The related question about, I consider to be a supply chain question. That is, we can knock down bad internet traffic, but if the chips that we're buying from geopolitical adversaries contain phone home programs that are hardwired, then we're in trouble. I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about the Internet of Things. If bad security is baked in, or if spyware is baked in, and these things are coming overseas to live in our homes, then we're failing. I think we do need legislation, as you proposed, to solve this problem, simply because the critical infrastructure in which these chips and computers are going is not owned or controlled by the government. And there was a recent amendment to legislation authorizing something called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States last year that gave that committee greater control over supply chain and less than control investments in U.S. critical infrastructure. But there is more to be done.
Company where the CEO and the CFO's emails were hacked in negotiations with a Chinese company makes me wonder, given that the propensity of all of our communications as a CEO of a company are via email these days, how secure is our national email infrastructure? Right? And I don't just mean the endpoints in terms of the user getting hacked through a phishing attack, but all those intermediary points along the way through the ISPs, et cetera. Should there be some kind of initiative to kind of shore up our whole entire email infrastructure?
I think there should be, and I think there is. I mean, as the one of the reasons for broadcasting that, one of the reasons for the federal government broadcasting that initiative was to get the private sector to think about it, not just companies to protect their own email, but I believe the tech sector to design solutions that would prevent that type of hack from happening. And even in the last 2 or 3 years, more and more solutions, plugins to your Gmail or additional programs that could be linked up with Outlook are coming on the scene to provide encrypted communication between endpoints. But that's hard. And one thing we found is that hackers will grab the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is actually stealing credentials in order to get total and complete unfettered access to an entire raft of emails, rather than trying to catch lightning in a bottle with a message en route. And unfortunately, it's still very easy to do because of folks, even in the government, using bad cyber hygiene habits.
Seen from the other side, social media and social networks are highly invasive. And if you think about it, Facebook has achieved what the Stasi never did. So if you're looking at the other side, the option was to weaponize it against us. Now, the irony is that Facebook is a private corporation, which through its actions is putting the country at risk. What's being done to look at the way that we regulate or work with our private companies and their actions, which are indeed invasive, to ensure that they are not putting us as a whole at risk? Because Radio Free Europe was invasive, but it was controlled at the back end. And so how do we do that without violating our civil liberties, but at the same time without making us sacrificial lambs?
Yeah, Two or three very, very quick points. The first one is, I think we saw the beginnings of this with the hearings of the CEOs of various companies, including Facebook and Twitter, before Congress at the end of last year. There is no legislation in place, nor do I think there's really a congressional plan in place to regulate these entities at the national level, but the discussion is beginning. The hearings made very clear to us what had happened, what had gone right, what had gone wrong, that allowed the Russians to weaponize those platforms. And the fact of the congressional investigations indicates that Congress is thinking about it. I don't, as I stand here, know if they're going to act, but it also served another purpose, which is broadcasting, which is letting us know how our data has the potential to be used. So user behavior changes also will help this process along. But the final point is, I urge caution. I don't think the United States, I know the United States, should not be in the role of censor for what is posted on Facebook, of determining what is hashtag fake news and what is not. But there are solutions between doing that, which I consider to be unconstitutional, and doing nothing. And it is my hope that Congress will continue to explore how to do that.
Okay, on that note, conflicted but optimistic, let's join me in thanking Gus for being with us tonight.
Thank you.